To say that I'm pleased to make this presentation wouldn't exactly be accurate. I'm terrified because I'm the only journalist and generalist amongst a very qualified people focusing on specific critical theory. So, but I'll keep my presentation short and hope we can have a bit of a Q&A after this, which will make it more interesting. Though I have experience of reporting on conflict in Punjab and in Kashmir for many years, I will confine myself to my years in Afghanistan. Since as a freelancer, I was forced to think about the choices I made on what to report on and how to report it. Afghanistan also has wider recall value through the overexposed iconic images that have represented it for nearly 40 years. And it would be interesting to know what you think about when you hear the word Afghanistan. Quick round. What do you think? Quick round? War? I was actually expecting some. For me. As people of art, you of course have a wider imagination, but for most people, the immediate visual imagery is of violence. Bombs and suicide bombers, military operations and attacks, tanks, guns, and uniformed soldiers. That is certainly a big part of the reality of Afghanistan, but I would like to use that as a departure point to interrogate the representations of such sites of conflict in and through mainstream media. Most of the visual imagery, both visual and textual, on such sites comes through a certain breed called the war correspondent. This term itself is extremely problematic. By using the lens of the war correspondent, we have already ceded territory, the opportunity to see a region, a country, a people through multiple maps of the mind. It is an extremely militarized approach to reporting, reducing complex areas of conflict to linear narratives. Following the logic of this approach, the final arbiter is the body count. The numbers situate the conflict area in a hierarchy of conflicts, determining which one we will pay attention to for the moment. As the body count increases, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 are no longer enough to get our attention. It takes at least 100 or 150 dead in Iraq before it causes a minor ripple. The numbers also insulate us from having to think about the living, the multiple strategies they use for survival, the numerous ways of disintegration of lives, and the many, many small and big triumphs and celebrations. In such extraordinary sites of contestation, the reporting is often an unvaried and even vapid coverage. And here I don't at all mean to suggest that the people reporting on these places are not brave or are not remarkable, but the reporting is extremely one-dimensional. The reductionist or simplified approach applies even to the theater of war, eschewing nuanced realities. I will draw on two examples here because both are well known. They both relate to the imagery constructed around the Taliban's ill treatment of women and their exclusion from public sphere of life. This is well known and rightly condemned. What is perhaps less well known is that the Taliban also banned some of the more egregious parts of the Pashtunwali code, customary law practiced amongst Pashtuns, relating to the giving away of women in reparation or exchange, the practices of Badh and Badal. This in no way condones the Taliban approach or purpose to present their laws as better than any customary law. My intention is only to draw attention to the linear representations, not just of the Taliban as a group, but of the issues related to women's rights. A more nuanced portrayal would have situated the constricted rights of Afghan women in a wider global and regional context, part of the continuum of a larger struggle, rather than isolating it as a phenomenon solely related to the Taliban presence. In fact, another post-Taliban reductionist imagery has been to use the sighting of the burqa, or the absence of it, as a quick survey of the state of women's rights. Meanwhile, cutesy little burqa wine bottle covers were all the rage when I lived in Kabul, a time when I also got into many arguments with so-called feminists over my use of a headscarf, but that's another story. The other iconic image, of course, is that of the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan. While their destruction was rightly condemned and was a seminal moment in the demonization of the Taliban, there has been very little comment or discussion around why the Buddhas were destroyed only in March 2001, though the Taliban had been in power in Kandahar from 1994 and in Kabul from 1996. In fact, journalists who have reported on Afghanistan in depth have pointed out how the early years of Taliban rule saw them issue edicts to protect the Buddhas. The act of destruction came at the end of a long-run attempt by the Al-Qaeda to isolate the Taliban from the international community, and in doing so, turn Afghanistan into a more comfortable safe haven from them. I'll just show you some slides. Oh, thanks. The importance of this is not that it mitigates the crimes of the Taliban, but that an understanding of the way the regime changed over the years could also have helped understand it and therefore deal with it better, both politically and militarily. In fact, I was at a press conference at the Presidential Palace in Kabul where Condi Rice came for a meeting with Karzai and kept remarking throughout the press conference, "We have a thinking enemy," as if the fact that they thunk was somehow reason why other people had not done better. The linear approach continues to inform the way Afghanistan is represented, over-reported and under-comprehended. Where are the millions of stories about how lives change when people are displaced? For example, you migrate and lose access to the spices you cooked with. What happens when you have a generation that has grown up less educated than their parents? What happens to a capital city, the image here, which swells from a city with a capacity to have 700,000 people before the war to 5 million as refugees return and find they can't go home? The single biggest cause of death was maternal mortality, not conflict. How do you return telecommunication to a country where you can't install landlines because of landmines? How do you create space for expression and communication in a country where colliding cultures make public performances and meetings extremely risky? To answer just the last question, one of the ways in which people extended their lives, much beyond what was permissible and possible, was through art. One of my incredibly exciting moments was to walk into an exhibition of contemporary art by young Afghan women. I'll just show you a few of their slides. For these women, contemporary art was a way of expressing themselves, their dilemmas and thoughts, their challenges and sorrows, their anger and strengths in ways which they could not do otherwise. Painting could be done inside their homes if needed, and the non-figurative art gave them greater room for experimentation. Theater adapted from Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed produced not just powerful moving performances about war, but allowed the participating women to build communities of support and express their suppressed pain. The restoration of Bagh-e-Babar, the graveyard and garden of Emperor Babur, was not just a monument restored, but Kabul's first public space that enabled families who until then would go to picnic spots with the women left inside the cars to sit under trees and eat together. Not all of these stories are unreported, obviously. They are just lost in the overwhelming imagery of violence that permeates representation of Afghanistan and similar sites, raising for all of us the question, what do we say, write, portray about all these sites? I'll end this with asking all of you a question. What do you read when you are reading about areas of conflict? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aunohita, for that presentation. You've discussed the phenomenon of the war correspondence and its challenges in reporting around conflict and its pitfalls in their tendency to reduce complex areas of conflict to linear narratives. And you've taken the case study of Afghanistan, and I quote you, over-reported, under-comprehended. Your question at the end, what do we say, write, portray? What do you read about your areas of conflict? It makes me think, within the frame of your experience, of your own, within the frame of your own professional experience, within your journey, from reporting, for example, in Afghanistan, to moving to being the editor of the Himal Magazine. What has changed in terms of the way in which you deal with text, and what lessons could you take from that as a way to start to respond to the question?
I think having reported on conflict for so long and having lived in such an intense place as Afghanistan, I had to ask myself the question, am I also a war junkie? And I didn't really know the answer to that. I knew that Afghanistan was intense and under my skin. But I work now with a magazine which is a small magazine published out of Kathmandu, and it has struggled for a long time for survival. For me, they provided an independent platform to write when I was in Afghanistan, and when it was nearly closing down, that was the impetus for me to leave Kabul and move to Kathmandu, going from something which is probably was the most reported story globally to something which is hardly on the radar of people until we had the earthquake, of course, last year. So I think what informed me and continues to inform me is spaces which would give people a way of looking at these things beyond just the simplistic narration. So this issue that we had actually a couple of months ago on Bangladesh, one of the primary motivating factors for in the way we put it together was Bangladesh, especially in the media in our region, comes up only when there is some incident of violence. In the Indian media, it comes in the media when there is a cross-border issue. So we felt that there are so many dimensions to this country which are underreported. And the violence is important and must be reported, but there's so many other dimensions. And that's what we try to do in our reporting, to look at things from various dimensions, not just a unidimensional portrait of a people or a country, and including especially areas of conflict.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from our group before we move on? If not, we'll continue the discussion at the end. Thank you. Devika.
You publish out of Kathmandu, right? I was wondering how that enables you. I was reading the endorsement of Romana Talper, and she makes the point about the diverse geographies that publishing out of Kathmandu enables you to engage with. Is that something maybe that you want to discuss?
Yes, my hometown is Delhi, so I'm an Indian, and I find the Indian media is, of course, extremely dominant in this region, but extremely insular and incurious. So what we find being based in Kathmandu is enormously challenging in terms of the practicalities of running, publishing a magazine, physically carrying out copies from Kathmandu. But it gives us also editorial neutrality. And perhaps this is more a matter of perception, because I think we would be doing the same work no matter where we were based. But if we were sitting in India and critiquing Pakistan, there would be this thing that, oh, because you're Indians, or vice versa. Being in Kathmandu really helps others also perceive our neutrality, and we can interrogate nationalistic and jingoistic discourses in a way which other places might be more difficult to do.
just a kind of small aside from the kind of question that you would ask otherwise. I'd like to tell you that when you talk about Afghanistan, I not only remember the war zone, but I remember a very interesting film called Kandahar, remember by Samira Makmalbaum. It's a fantastic film of a journalist traveling across under disguise, undercover journalist traveling across. So that's precisely what you do. One. Number two is the Kabuliwala's wife, that novel by the lady who got killed at the end of the day because of going there over there second time. Third thing I remember is the kind of Syed Mustafa Ali's writing about Kabul. That's kind of from 1940s and 50s. The Bengali novelist, writer, basically, travel writer, a very famous travel writer. He's from Bangladesh, incidentally. But he taught in Shantiniketan, he taught in Cairo, he taught in Germany. He taught German in Germany, he taught Arabic in Cairo, and he taught many other things in Shantiniketan. The language, Bengali language in Shantiniketan. So it's a superb, so three different kind of memorabilia sort of informs me also along this normal reporting. So this, I mean, like, I don't know, it's an observation just.
Yeah, I think it's a pity when we look back at these older texts, there was so much warmth and understanding of people of Afghanistan. But I think that is something in the past. If I look at the approach of people who have gone from the region into Afghanistan now, and let me talk about India since I am an Indian, I find it shocking actually because the approach is that Afghans are a dirtier, poorer, more backward way, the way India used to be. And there has been very little appreciation of the enormous dignity and the enormous, what we can learn from people who have lived through that. So Indians would go to Afghanistan because you can earn big money, in a conflict zone if you choose to, and live in little ghettoized communities and hardly interact with this. So it's a pity that we were more adventurous as a people earlier than we are now.
I'm very, because during your presentation, of course, I was thinking about war photography, and you spoke about this notion of war junkie, and because of course what it comes to mind in media news is of course this notion of images of violence. And what was fascinating to me in your talk is that, in thinking especially in photographic terms, is the notion of the foreground and the background. And therefore, there seems to be that the media are very used to focus on the foreground, while there is this attempt in your work to enable the background to come forth. And yeah, I'm very curious to know, like, what do you think about this? Also, if you can go a little bit back to the very notion of war junkie, but also to from where did you from the very beginning of your talk and to the war correspondent role?
Yeah, I think the issue of foreground and the background, I think media in general globally, there is less and less space for exploration. So what you do is whether you're an editor or a reporter or somebody deciding what's getting into the bulletin or the page of the day, you pick and choose. And in that process, the immediate violence always takes precedence. So I was in Afghanistan as a freelancer, which was really difficult, but I obviously had to constantly sell stories, which is why I've written for so many people. But most of the time, the response would be, we have this limited amount of space for Afghanistan, and this has already been taken by this strategic military operation or this incident of violence, or whichever media was writing for our country's military interests in that area. So all the other news would take second place. So obviously the military story is important, and I'm not at all suggesting it's not, but it has a way of then pushing out everything else. And of course, when you are telling a story about a complex place, there is, you also want to communicate to your readers. So very often I would be told, oh, the story you have written is far too complex for our readers. Basically they want to know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, and who's winning. So, don't get into nuance. And it was, because I was there for such a long time, it is fascinating to me to also see how different media approached my stories. So I found the American and British media extremely, let's say, limited in their ability to take stories with nuance. The Indian media, which I was pitching to all the time, were just not interested. They wanted me to write stories on Pakistan's perfidy in Afghanistan and nothing else. The European media, and unfortunately I came to this late, otherwise I would have started writing for them much earlier, many of them were far more nuanced in the kind of stories they would take. They would take multi-layered stories. And another thing which I discovered very late, and it was that if you are a journalist in an area of war, you shouldn't always go to the foreign editor or the defense editor to pitch your stories. You should go to the arts editor or the development editor. So it's just a practical thing, But in the end, it also defines how things get covered. You asked about being a war junkie. I think these places are so intense that many of us find it really hard to become normal after you come out. And because I was in Afghanistan for such a long time, I saw many people who tried to leave but would keep coming back. Or they would go from one war to another war to another war. Because there is something about the immediacy of the war. And of course, as a journalist, if you're writing from a war zone, you can get much better coverage. Writing about the same issue in a normal area might not get you so much access. So you have, you are a little bit celebrated because you're living in a danger zone, and you get, so there is something, I think, addictive about that. But if you're calling yourself a war correspondent, then I think already you've lost the battle of talking about a place which is so much more than just the war.
I just want to make a small comment, because it's on the issue of photography that we are of war. Because let us not forget that wars are now today enacted through aerial photography and the aerial view, which flattens out the background and the foreground. And I could go on a little longer to talk about an art project which I found particularly offensive, which was done by a Norwegian and Danish duo of artists who actually decided to fly all the way from Oslo to Afghanistan, because they had read a newspaper report about an Afghani girl called Farial who wanted to fly. And what they did was that they actually flew in the aeroplane, making stopovers in Turkey, Iran, etc., taking permissions from the government, discovering what aerial views were of the continent. And one of the things that they discovered, for example, was that in Turkey, the Air Force was entirely womaned by women flyers because they're smaller and then can also fly aeroplanes better. So the Air Force in Turkey actually has many women fighter pilots. But when they actually crossed into Afghanistan, they found that the air was controlled below the view of the radar. Because if you fly extremely low, you can actually escape radar surveillance. And they landed in Kabul or in Afghanistan on the border, without understanding or realizing that the people who were manning the radars, who were Afghanis, would probably be thrown into jail. Because, ultimately it was their lack of being able to capture, hold, focus on them that allowed actually them to land.
Of their countries, because there were so many troop contributing countries there, they would have this militarized round of the country and leave without having seen anything really.
About our subject, your subject, and my question to you was about responsibility. So as a journalist looking at what you do and other journalists, do you have a responsibility that is different to the work of people that write about art in terms of what's at stake? And in terms of also, I guess, looking at critical writing, is there a criticality there that is different?
I think the responsibilities are not really different at all. But in the case of journalists, because you're writing about the lives of people every day, perhaps there's a greater immediacy. If you are an artist, perhaps you can choose, what your responsibility will be. But as a journalist, you're making that decision sometimes several times a day, just in terms of what you're going to report on and how you're going to report on it, what you're going to leave out. So it's not something that you can really step away from.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aunohita.